The sun dipped low over Maplewood Estates, casting long shadows across the neat rows of houses, lined with freshly mown lawns and pristine flower beds. At first glance, the neighborhood was the very picture of suburban tranquility. Birds chirping, children playing, neighbors chatting by white picket fences. But beneath this calm surface, an invisible tension simmered, growing thicker with each passing day. Grandpa Joe sat on his porch in his worn rocking chair, his eyes narrowing as a familiar black and white cruiser rolled slowly down the street. Officer Mills, the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer, was back on patrol. The man's sharp gaze scanned every driveway, every parked car, every small detail, with the cold precision of a hawk hunting its prey. To most residents, Mills was a symbol of order and safety. To Joe, he was a looming threat, a reminder that freedom in this neighborhood came with invisible shackles. Joe's old pickup truck sat in its usual spot, half on the driveway, half on the street. The truck was more than just a vehicle. It was a relic of his younger days, a badge of stubborn independence he wasn't ready to give up. It bore dents and scratches, like battle scars. A faded decal on the window boasting, "Built not bought." But in Maplewood Estates, such relics were frowned upon, especially by the HOA. The Homeowners Association had grown stricter in recent months. Every rule was enforced with renewed zeal. No cars on the street overnight. No unapproved plants. No unsightly decorations. And Officer Mills was the HOA's heavy hand, delivering warnings and citations with relentless determination. Today, the truck's time had come. The cruiser slowed and stopped right in front of Joe's house. Officer Mills stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the porch. Joe didn't rise immediately, his gaze fixed on the man with a mixture of defiance and weariness. "Mr. Henderson," Mills began, voice clipped and professional, "this is your final warning. The truck is parked in violation of HOA regulations. It needs to be moved onto your property or removed entirely. Failure to comply will result in fines and possible further action." Joe's jaw tightened. "It's been here for 20 years, Mills. You and your HOA didn't make this neighborhood," he muttered, voice low but steady. "I ain't moving it for some new rule." Mills's eyes hardened. "The rules apply to everyone, sir. You can't pick and choose which ones you follow." Joe's fingers clenched around the arm of his chair, knuckles white. The neighborhood was changing. The warmth of old community replaced by cold control, and Officer Mills was the spearhead of that change. The officer gave a curt nod and turned to leave. But as he did, a faint murmur rose from the neighbors, watching from behind curtains and hedges. Some shook their heads in sympathy for Joe, while others nodded in agreement with Mills, tired of the old ways that clogged the neighborhood with relics and stubbornness. Joe's granddaughter Lily stepped out from the side gate just as Mills got into his cruiser. "Grandpa," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe this time it's best to listen. They're serious. This isn't just about a truck anymore. It's about control." Joe looked down at her, the fire in his eyes dimming for a moment. "Control," he echoed. "Well, maybe it's time someone reminded them who's really in charge around here." As the cruiser disappeared around the corner, Joe's mind began to churn. The battle was just beginning. And this quiet street was about to become the stage for a reckoning no one saw coming. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, but the air in Maplewood Estates felt heavier, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. Word of Officer Mills's warning to Grandpa Joe had spread quickly, buzzing quietly like static under the calm. Some residents felt a thrill of anticipation, others a creeping unease. It was as if a fault line had opened beneath their feet, and no one quite knew where the tremors would end. Grandpa Joe sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, eyes fixed on the faded photograph of his late wife, pinned to the corkboard. The truck, his stubborn symbol of independence, was on his mind more than ever. To him, it was more than metal and rust. It was a living memory, a bridge to the past, and a challenge to the tightening grip of the HOA. A sharp knock broke the silence. Joe's granddaughter, Lily, who had stayed overnight, jumped up and opened the door. There, standing with an impassive face, was Officer Mills once again. His presence was no accident. The warning had turned into a formal visit. "Mr. Henderson," Mills said without preamble, "I'm here to remind you that the HOA's deadline is fast approaching. You have 48 hours to move that truck. No exceptions." Joe stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under his weight. "Mills, I've been living in this neighborhood longer than you've been alive. This truck isn't going anywhere just because the HOA says so." Mills's eyes narrowed. "You're skating on thin ice, Joe. This isn't a threat. It's a fact. Ignore this, and the HOA will take further action." Joe clenched his fists, feeling the familiar burn of defiance flare inside him. But beneath that pride lurked something else, a flicker of doubt, a whisper of worry about what further action might mean. That afternoon, neighbors gathered discreetly in small clusters, their voices low but urgent. Behind the hedge, Mrs. Watkins whispered to her husband, "Joe's gonna blow up that truck if they push him. I've known him for years. He's not one to back down." Across the street, young couple Sarah and Mark exchanged anxious glances. "Do you think the HOA is going too far?" Sarah asked, biting her lip. Mark shrugged. "They have the rules. But Joe's not just anyone. This could get ugly." Late that night, as the neighborhood settled into uneasy sleep, a series of mysterious sounds stirred the darkness. Quiet creaks of tires on gravel, faint voices exchanging hurried words, the whisper of leaves brushing against one another. Someone was moving stealthily near the creek that bordered the back of the neighborhood. Inside his house, Grandpa Joe lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The silence was broken only by the ticking clock, each second ticking down toward the inevitable showdown. His mind raced through possibilities. What if the HOA forced him out? What if Officer Mills took things too far? The old truck was his. Last stand. Outside, shadows moved like ghosts in the night. A group of neighbors, hidden from view, exchanged glances. They had been quietly supporting Joe. People tired of the HOA's iron-fisted rules. People who remembered what community used to mean. Tonight, something was about to change. At the edge of the creek, the headlights of a truck pierced the darkness. Tires spun in the mud. The engine revved low and steady. There was a hint of purpose in the way the vehicle moved. Deliberate and controlled. What was happening here? An act of rebellion? Or something more? Back inside, Lily's unease grew. She glanced at Grandpa Joe, who sat rigid and silent. "Grandpa, whatever you're planning," she whispered, "please be careful. This isn't just about a truck anymore. It's about everything." Joe's lips pressed into a thin line. "Sometimes," he said softly, "you have to make a stand, even if it shakes the whole neighborhood." As the night deepened, the first crack appeared in the calm of Maplewood Estates. A crack that promised to widen into something no one could ignore. The morning sun struggled to burn through the heavy grey clouds that rolled over Maplewood Estates, casting a dim light over the neat rows of houses. But the neighborhood no longer felt bright or calm. A shadow had settled, one born of uncertainty and brewing conflict. Grandpa Joe's old truck sat stubbornly in its usual place, half on the driveway, half blocking the street. The rusted tailgate caught drops of rain, the faded paint peeling under years of neglect. To anyone else, it was a nuisance. An eyesore flagged repeatedly by the HOA. But to Joe, it was a symbol of resilience. A stand against the tightening grip of the new rules. Despite Officer Mills's warnings, Joe hadn't moved the truck. In fact, he hadn't even replied to the HOA's increasingly urgent letters and notices. His silence was not ignorance, but a deliberate act of defiance. A message to the neighborhood and to Mills that he would not be bullied into submission. Inside his modest home, Joe's granddaughter Lily watched him with growing concern. "Grandpa, the HOA's not just going to give up," she urged. "They're planning something. The meeting's coming up, and they're serious about enforcing the rules." Joe's eyes twinkled with a mix of stubborn pride and a hint of mischief. "Let 'em come. I'm ready." As dusk fell, the neighborhood took on a different character. Windows flickered with the soft glow of lamps, but behind them, whispers traveled like wildfire. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the brewing conflict, the standoff between a man and the powerful HOA. Then came the noises. Strange, unsettling sounds that slipped through the night. The sharp crunch of gravel under tires, faint voices exchanging hurried words, the rustle of leaves disturbed by movement. Something was happening at the creek that bordered the back of the neighborhood. The same creek where Joe often went, fishing, a place of quiet refuge, now transformed into the scene of a secret meeting. Peeking through his curtains, Joe caught sight of several shadowy figures, moving stealthily near the water's edge. He recognized some of the neighbors, Mrs. Carter from 2 houses down, Mr. Lopez from across the street. They had gathered in secret, a small band united by frustration and hope. Joe stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached them. "What's going on?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Carter glanced around nervously before speaking. "We can't stand by while they bully you, Joe. This neighborhood used to be about community, not rules written to squeeze us. Dry? We're planning something that will send a message." Joe's heart pounded with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "You're serious?" Mr. Lopez nodded firmly. "Dead serious. The HOA thinks they can break you, but they haven't met the whole neighborhood yet." The plan was simple but bold. A coordinated act of defiance that would disrupt the HOA's tightening grip. Starting with Joe's truck. As the night deepened, Joe and his allies prepared in silence. Tools were gathered, paths scouted. The Bites Creek became a secret stage for a rebellion quietly taking shape. Every movement was charged with the thrill of risk, the weight of consequence. Back in his house, Lily paced anxiously. "Grandpa, please don't do anything reckless." Joe looked at her, his face lined with years of hard-earned wisdom. "Sometimes, Lily, the only way to protect what matters is to take a stand, no matter the cost." The moon climbed higher, casting pale light over the neighborhood, now pulsing with anticipation. Somewhere between hope and fear, a quiet revolution was about to begin, and no one could predict how far it would go. The clock was ticking, and with every passing hour, the tension in Maplewood Estates grew thicker, almost tangible, like a storm cloud ready to break. 48 hours remained before the HOA's deadline would expire, and with it, the last chance for Grandpa Joe to move his truck or face the consequences. Joe sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of official notices the HOA had dropped on his doorstep like cold stones. The words "final notice," "fines," and "legal action" were stamped in bold, a relentless reminder that this was no longer a game. The HOA wasn't bluffing, and neither was Officer Mills, who had intensified his patrols. His presence, a constant shadow stalking the streets. Outside, neighbors watched anxiously from behind closed curtains and half-shut blinds. The quiet camaraderie that had formed around Joe was tempered now by fear and uncertainty. Could one man really stand against the iron will of the HOA and their merciless enforcer? Lily paced the room, her face drawn with worry. Grandpa, they're watching everything. The patrols, the cameras. It's like living under a microscope. If you do anything at all, they'll catch it. Please be careful. Joe's eyes glinted with stubborn resolve. Careful won't do it this time. Lily, sometimes you've got to shake the cage to see what falls out. As evening approached, the neighborhood's tension became almost unbearable. The streets felt deserted, every car engine silent, every dog hushed, as if bracing for the inevitable. Officer Mills's cruiser prowled steadily, his sharp gaze scanning for any hint of defiance. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a faint rumble disturbed the stillness. Tires rolling over gravel, the unmistakable growl of an engine starting up. Grandpa Joe was ready. With the confidence of a man who had nothing left to lose, Joe climbed into his truck, the worn leather seat creaking beneath him. He glanced once more at the faded decal on the window, a symbol of pride and history. With a deep breath, he started the engine, the roar breaking the silence like thunder. Behind the curtains, neighbors held their breath. This was no longer a simple parking dispute. This was a showdown, a battle of wills, with the entire community watching in suspended disbelief. Joe maneuvered the truck carefully through the driveway, his eyes locked on the narrow path leading to the creek, a place no towing company dared enter. The muddy banks loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, but it was the only place where his truck could be safe from the HOA's reach. Just as Joe reached the edge of the creek, the headlights of Officer Mills's cruiser swept over the street, casting a harsh spotlight. The officer's voice crackled over the radio, commanding backup, but it was too late. With a grinding roar, the truck plunged forward, tires spinning in the mud as it slid down the embankment and splashed into the creek's murky waters. The moment seemed to freeze, the neighborhood silent, hearts pounding with shock and disbelief. Officer Mills arrived seconds later, breathless and furious. "What the hell are you doing, Joe?" he barked. But the old man only shook his head, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. From their windows, neighbors erupted into whispered cheers and stunned silence. Caught between admiration for Joe's audacity and fear of the consequences, the truck was stuck, deep in the creek, immovable, untouchable by the HOA's usual methods. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. But beneath the victory lay a question nobody dared voice aloud. What would Officer Mills and the HOA do next? The showdown was far from over. Moonlight spilled over the quiet neighborhood, like a silver curtain, casting long shadows that twisted and danced between the neatly trimmed hedges and manicured lawns of Maplewood Estates. But beneath this peaceful glow, a storm of silent rebellion was about to break. Grandpa Joe sat behind the wheel of his truck, the engine humming low but steady. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles white with resolve. The cold night air seeped through the cracked window, but it did nothing to chill the fire burning in his chest. This was it, the moment where quiet defiance would roar into something unforgettable. Across the street, a cluster of neighbors watched through half-open blinds, their faces tense with anticipation and fear. Among them, Lily stood pressed against the window, heart pounding. "Be careful, Grandpa. she whispered under her breath. Joe nodded to himself, eyes scanning the street with cautious determination. Officer Mills's cruiser was nowhere in sight, but that didn't mean the danger had passed. The man was relentless, and Joe knew backup was never far behind. With a deep breath, Joe shifted the truck into gear and eased it onto the street. The engine's growl filled the still night as he began his slow, deliberate journey toward the creek, the neighborhood's boundary and the edge of freedom. As Joe turned the corner, headlights suddenly sliced through the darkness. Mills was back, faster than anyone expected. The cruiser's siren wailed, a harsh, piercing sound that shattered the night's calm. Joe's heart hammered in his chest, but he didn't falter. The truck's tires bit into the asphalt, kicking up loose gravel as Joe accelerated toward the creek behind him. The siren grew louder, the cruiser closing the distance with determined speed. Neighbors spilled into their yards, some clutching phones to capture the moment, others simply frozen in disbelief. "Go, Joe!" they shouted in hushed voices. A collective breath held in hope and fear. The truck barreled toward the muddy bank of the creek, its headlights reflecting in the water's dark surface. Joe's hands were steady, his gaze locked on the narrow slope that few dared to navigate. With a sudden jolt, the truck's wheels left the pavement and plunged into the soft mud. Tires spun wildly, spraying dirt and water into the air. The truck slid and slipped, but Joe held the wheel firm, steering toward the water's edge. Then, with a grinding crunch and a splash that echoed through the still night, the truck broke through the creek's shallow edge and settled into the murky water. The engine sputtered, water splashing against the hood as the vehicle came to rest. For a moment, silence fell again. The neighborhood held its breath. Officer Mills skidded to a halt on the opposite bank, his face a mask of shock and fury. "Damn it, Joe!" he shouted, but the old man only gave a slow, triumphant smile. From their windows, neighbors erupted into quiet cheers and whispered exclamations. The truck was safe, unreachable by towing companies or fines. It was a one-way trip to freedom, but the victory was bittersweet. Joe knew the HOA wouldn't let this stand without retaliation. Officer Mills would escalate. There would be consequences, maybe even legal battles. Yet beneath it all, something had changed. The neighborhood's silence had been broken. A spark of rebellion had ignited, and the fight for their community was far from over. As Joe climbed out of the truck, water dripping from his boots, he caught Lily's eyes through the dark. She nodded, pride and worry mixed in her gaze. The midnight escape was complete, but the story of Maplewood Estates was just beginning. The morning after Grandpa Joe's midnight escape, Maplewood Estates was buzzing with an energy it hadn't seen in years. The old truck, half submerged in the creek, had become an unspoken symbol of resistance, a monument to stubborn defiance against the rigid rules choking the neighborhood. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, some inspired, others anxious about the inevitable fallout. The HOA wasn't the forgiving type, and Officer Mills was already sharpening his claws for the next move. Joe sat on his porch, wrapped in his worn jacket, eyes fixed on the muddy water where his truck rested. It wasn't just metal and rust. Now, it was a message, but the message had provoked a reaction far beyond what Joe had expected. That afternoon, a sleek black SUV rolled slowly down the street, the windows tinted like dark mirrors. Out stepped Mrs. Crawford, the HOA president, a woman as sharp and unyielding as the bylaws she enforced. She carried a thick binder of papers and a clipboard, her expression a mask of icy control. "Mr. Henderson," she called out as she approached Joe's porch. "We need to discuss your situation." Joe rose slowly, eyeing her with quiet suspicion. "This neighborhood was built on respect, Mrs. Crawford, not fear." Mrs. Crawford's smile was thin and controlled. "Respect is earned through compliance, Joe. Your actions have forced our hand. The HOA board has voted to impose hefty fines, and if necessary, pursue legal action to remove your truck and ensure it never returns." Joe's jaw clenched. "You'll have to do better than that." As Mrs. Crawford turned to leave, Officer Mills appeared behind her, his presence darkening the air. "We'll be watching, Joe. Next time there won't be a warning." The neighborhood felt the weight of their words like a storm rolling in. That evening, Joe met with his small band of supporters. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Lopez, Lily, and a few others gathered in his living room, the air thick with tension and determination. "We can't let them win," Mrs. Carter said firmly. "They're trying to break us. One fine, one threat at a time." Mr. Lopez nodded. "We need a plan. Something legal maybe. Or something bigger that makes them think twice." Lily spoke softly but firmly. "Grandpa's fight is everyone's fight now, but we have to be smart. The HOA has lawyers, cameras, and power. We don't." Joe's eyes met hers, a spark of pride flickering through the worry. "Sometimes you've got to fight fire with fire, but not recklessly." Outside, the quiet streets of Maplewood Estates felt charged. Every mailbox, every flower bed, every crack in the sidewalk, a silent witness to the brewing war. The HOA was gearing up for battle, and the residents were caught in the crossfire. As night fell, Joe stood once more on his porch, looking at the creek where his truck waited like a sentinel. The road ahead was uncertain, the risks higher than ever. But one thing was clear. The fight for their neighborhood was no longer just about a truck. It was about dignity, freedom, and reclaiming a sense of community lost beneath layers of rules and control, and Grandpa Joe was ready. Days passed since Grandpa Joe's truck had taken its defiant refuge in the muddy creek, and the air in Maplewood Estates was thick with tension, but also an unspoken unity. The once quiet streets now buzzed with whispered plans and furtive meetings. Joe's act of rebellion had stirred something deep inside the community, a fire that was hard to ignore. Mrs. Crawford's looming threats and the looming fines had rattled many, but they had also ignited a spark of courage in others. Across the neighborhood, neighbors began to organize, pooling their resources and sharing ideas. They weren't just defending a rusty old truck anymore. They were defending their rights, their voice, and the heart of their community. One evening, in Joe's modest living room, the group gathered again, larger this time. There was Sarah and Mark from across the street, the shy but determined Patel family, and even some of the younger residents who had been quiet observers until now. Everyone brought something to the table. Legal research, contacts with local journalists, suggestions for protests, and plans to petition the HOA board. "We need to make sure this doesn't just become another HOA dispute," Sarah said, her voice firm but hopeful. "We have to get the media involved, show the bigger picture, that this is about more than just one truck. It's about the rights of every homeowner." Joe nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him. "I never wanted this fight, but I'm proud it's brought us together. It's time they saw we're not afraid." Meanwhile, Officer Mills prowled the neighborhood, like a wolf circling its prey, growing more frustrated with each passing day. His threats had only made Joe and the neighbors more determined, and his usual tactics seemed to backfire at every turn. Late one night, as Joe and Lily sat on the porch, watching the stars blink overhead, a sudden noise shattered the quiet. A loud thud followed by hurried footsteps. Joe grabbed his flashlight and stepped cautiously toward the creek. His beam caught the shadowy figures of two men, moving suspiciously near the truck. His heart pounded. "What are you doing?" Joe called out, his voice steady but firm. The men froze, exchanging nervous glances. "We're here to check on the truck," one stammered. Joe's eyes narrowed. "The truck doesn't need your checking on. This is my property." With that, the men hurried away, but Joe's suspicion grew. The HOA was escalating. They were willing to cross lines, push boundaries, and maybe even break the law. Back in his living room, Joe shared the encounter with the group. "They're trying to intimidate us," he said grimly, "but we're stronger than their threats." The next day, the neighborhood awoke to flyers scattered across lawns, urging residents to attend a community meeting to discuss the HOA's actions and plan their response. The buzz of excitement and nervous anticipation was palpable. The meeting was packed. Voices rose and fell as neighbors shared stories, frustrations, and hopes. Some feared the HOA's power. Others demanded resistance. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the unyielding spirit of a community refusing to be silenced. In that charged room, Grandpa Joe stood tall, the weathered face of a man who had become a symbol of resilience. "This isn't just about a truck," he told them, voice steady and strong. "It's about standing up for what's right, for all of us. Together, we can change the story of Maplewood Estates." As the meeting ended, a plan had formed, a unified front to challenge the HOA's harsh measures. Legally, socially, and publicly, the neighborhood was rallying, and the fight was far from over. But deep beneath their resolve, a shadow lingered. Officer Mills's next move was unknown, and it promised to be the most dangerous yet. The tension in Maplewood Estates had reached a breaking point. Weeks of silent war between the residents and the HOA had transformed the once peaceful neighborhood into a battleground of wills, trust, and determination. But no one was prepared for the unexpected move that would turn the entire conflict on its head. It started on a foggy Saturday morning. Grandpa Joe was sipping his black coffee on the porch when Lily burst out of the house, waving a crumpled piece of paper. "Grandpa, you've got to see this," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Joe wiped his hands and took the paper. It was a copy of a new city ordinance recently passed, one that limited the powers of HOAs, especially concerning fines and property seizures. The law was a result of months of lobbying by neighborhood associations and activists who had grown tired of overbearing HOAs nationwide. "This changes everything," Joe muttered, his eyes scanning the fine print. The new regulation meant that the HOA's previous threats were not only legally questionable, but could be challenged and overturned in court. Word spread like wildfire. At the next neighborhood meeting, spirits soared. Mrs. Crawford arrived, her usual icy composure replaced by unease. The board's plans had been disrupted by a higher authority, the law itself. But the biggest surprise came later that evening. Officer Mills, known for his stern, no-nonsense approach, came knocking on Joe's door. The neighborhood held its breath. Joe opened the door cautiously. Mills stood there, no badge flashing, no cruiser in sight, just a man looking tired and conflicted. "I'm here to talk," Mills said quietly. Inside, the two men sat down, the room heavy with unspoken words. "I've been ordered to crack down hard," Mills began, voice low. "But after watching you, Joe, after seeing what this neighborhood has become, I'm not sure I'm on the right side anymore." Joe raised an eyebrow. "What are you saying?" Mills sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm saying I'm done being the bully. I want to help fix this, not make it worse. The conversation that followed was honest, tense, but unexpectedly hopeful. Mills confessed that the HOA's aggressive tactics had crossed lines, and he was willing to stand down if the residents agreed to work together for a fairer neighborhood. The news spread fast. Officer Mills was switching sides, becoming an advocate for reasonable compromise rather than enforcement. At a community meeting the next week, the mood was electric. The HOA board, faced with mounting legal challenges and a united neighborhood, was forced to back down. The fines were rescinded, the truck was allowed to stay, and the new city ordinance ensured a balance of power going forward. Grandpa Joe's truck remained in its muddy berth by the creek, a symbol of victory and resilience. But more than that, it was a testament to the power of standing up, to neighbors standing together, to a community reclaiming its voice. As the sun set over Maplewood Estates, Joe and Lily stood by the creek, the truck gleaming softly in the warm, fading light. "Looks like your one-way trip wasn't so one-way after all," Lily said with a grin. Joe chuckled, patting the truck's rusted hood. "Sometimes it's not about where you go. It's about the stand you take along the way." And in Maplewood Estates, that stand had changed everything, forever.